While ships poured out of Europe, setting sail for the furthest reaches of the earth, back on the continent, religion and politics was the order of the day. During the Renaissance, ideologies gradually shifted, leading to an early modern Europe not just split politically, but spiritually. As the late Middle Ages ended, European heads of state attempted to centralize their governments and move away from the feudal system that marked the medieval age. We've spoken about these new monarchs in our last mega-documentary. Their centralization efforts undermined local lords and nobility, as well as the local population through higher taxes, to be able to amass larger standing armies. Moreover, the Church, which was once in a tug-of-war with the state, was firmly placed in a subservient position within state hierarchies, as monarchs acquired more political power. Economic power was previously held by the Italian merchants, most notably the Venetians by the late Middle Ages, and by a confederation of commercial merchant guilds and market towns in Central and Northern Europe, called the Hanseatic League. Just as the Italians dominated Mediterranean trade, the Hanseatic League dominated maritime trade in the Baltic and North Seas with their reliable trading cogs. But as time went on, and more centralized states discovered newer trading opportunities overseas during the Age of Discovery, the decentralized Hanseatic League and Italian city-states became less important. During the medieval period, these urban cities were mainly home to merchants and artisans, but by the early modern, the urban structure came to include an upper class called the patriciate, those who grew extremely wealthy from the emerging trade and banking. The petty burghers remained as a class beneath them, continuing their manufacturing guilds and shopkeeping. Below them were landless workers, who did various jobs for low wages, and were adjacent to the unemployed. These workers and unemployed folk made up from 1/3 to almost half of the population of urban centers. In rural areas, the manorial system had been in decline, and serfdom decreased substantially. More serfs became free, and peasants were able to keep a bigger share of their labor output. These rural peasants made up the lion's share of what was called the Third Estate, and along with the urban poor, would have a large part in the religious reform movements in the 1500s. What had a more immediate impact, though, was the development of printing. Though movable type printing was first developed in East Asia, it was perfected by the German inventor and craftsman Johannes Gutenberg, who introduced his movable type printing press, allowing millions of copies of books to be created and shipped across Europe. His printing press was tailored for the Latin alphabet, which contains a relatively small number of letters, making the setting of type faster and more efficient than in the character-based scripts of East Asia. By around 1500, up to 10 million copies were published of almost 40,000 different books made from printing presses on the continent. The very first was the Gutenberg Bible, published in 1455. Around half the total books were religious in nature, Bibles, sermons, or religious commentary, but the rest were mainly classical Latin and Greek works, philosophy, and legal texts. The dissemination of this knowledge led to a growing number of lay people becoming readers. While we discussed the Italian Renaissance in our last mega-documentary, the movement had soon spread north across the Alps. From this rich tapestry arose Christian humanism, intertwining faith with classical learning. It melded humanist concepts, not with the ancient classics of Greece and Rome, but with the study of classical Christianity. The goal was to change the individual, and through that, reform the church and society. Christian humanists criticized the ceremonial aspects and external rituals of the church, emphasizing instead the importance of inner piety and personal moral reformation. They encouraged a return to original biblical texts and early Christian writings, hoping to get a clearer understanding of Christian teachings. Perhaps the most well-known of these was Desiderius Erasmus, a Dutch Catholic priest and Christian humanist. He formulated the concept of the philosophy of Christ, a way of thinking that shifted Christianity to a role in directing one's daily life, instead of merely an outward display of rites and rituals, pilgrimages, and fasts, practices which the Church seemed to value. Thomas More, an English scholar, is best known for his work, Utopia, which described an idealized island society. The book blends humanist and Christian principles, envisioning a society where individuals live according to reason and Christian virtue. For Christian humanists, the goal was clear: return to the foundational texts of Christianity and the wisdom of the early Church Fathers. They believed in the marriage of ancient knowledge and Christian teachings, all aimed at moral and societal reform. Erasmus and his work was the seed, often called the egg, from which a later movement would hatch. Critiquing the Church's practices, yet from within its embrace, figures like Erasmus sought not a revolution, but a reformation. Apart from the shift to inner devotion, the Catholic Church was seen as becoming more corrupt. During the late Middle Ages until the early 1500s, a series of popes, or Renaissance popes, were seen as failures of Christendom and more as political leaders of the Papal States. Perhaps the most controversial Renaissance pope, Rodrigo Borgia, took the name Alexander VI upon his election. His papacy was marked by nepotism, political scheming, and allegations of immorality, having acknowledged fathering several children with his many mistresses. Julius II was known as a warrior pope, as he personally led his armies into battle, behavior more suited for a king than the spiritual leader of Christendom. As religious authorities became viewed more negatively, Christian adherents began searching for alternate ways to practice their religion. The veneration of relics, like objects associated with the saints, became more widespread. Frederick the Wise, a Saxon prince of the Holy Roman Empire, had a collection of 19,000 relics, believed to provide spiritual benefits to those who venerated them, including reductions of time spent in purgatory. On All Saints' Day each year, the relics were displayed for veneration, and the event attracted numerous pilgrims. These relics included a twig from the burning bush in the Moses story, hay from the Holy Manger, and milk from the Virgin Mary. People would venerate these as part of an indulgence. An indulgence, in Roman Catholic theology, refers to the remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, the guilt of which has been forgiven through the sacrament of reconciliation. In other words, while sin's guilt might be forgiven, there was still a punishment to be faced either in this life or in purgatory. Indulgences could, in theory, reduce the temporal punishment. By the late Middle Ages, abuses were common. While the Church maintained that indulgences couldn't be sold, donations associated with gaining indulgences started to resemble straightforward transactions. It appeared to many that salvation or a reduced time in purgatory was being sold to the highest bidder. Questors, or pardoners, would wander around collecting alms in exchange for salvation. Some indulgence sellers exaggerated the benefits of indulgences, suggesting, for example, that they could secure immediate salvation for oneself or even deceased loved ones. The sale of indulgences became a significant source of income for the Church. One of the most infamous episodes was the sale of indulgences by Renaissance Pope Leo X, to finance the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The abuse of indulgences was one of the primary catalysts for what became known as the Protestant Reformation. In the early 1500s, Martin Luther, a monk and professor at the University of Wittenberg in Germany, came to an impasse with the Church. Catholic doctrine stressed that both inner faith and good works were needed to achieve salvation. Luther emphasized the idea of sola fide, salvation by faith alone, that salvation is a free gift from God, received only by true repentance and faith in Jesus, not by human efforts or good works. On October 31, 1517, Luther reportedly nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. This act is often viewed as the spark of the Protestant Reformation. In these theses, Luther did not outright deny the power of the Pope to grant indulgences, but he attacked the abuse of such power, emphasizing the importance of inner repentance. Some points from the 95 Theses are that indulgences cannot remove guilt, that the Pope cannot remit any guilt except by declaring it forgiven by God, that Christians are to be taught that giving to the poor is better than purchasing indulgences, and that the assurance of salvation by letters of indulgence is vain. Luther was particularly incensed by the actions of Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar. Tetzel was commissioned to promote indulgences in Germany and was known for his dramatic sales pitch: "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." The 95 Theses were quickly translated from Latin into German and spread rapidly, thanks to the printing press. This widespread circulation led to growing debates and drew significant attention. Luther initially hoped to reform the Church from within. However, by 1520, the intensity of those opposing him pushed him and his followers towards a more radical break. In 1521, he was excommunicated by the Church and ordered to appear at the Diet of Worms, a deliberative assembly, where Luther was asked to recant his opposition to the Church. He refused, stating that his only authority is Scripture, not an assemblage of popes or councils. Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sided with the Church and issued the Edict of Worms, condemning Luther as a heretic and banning citizens from following his ideas. His emphasis on the priesthood of all believers and the direct relationship between God and the individual resonated with peasants who felt oppressed by both their secular lords and the church hierarchy. In 1524, one of the largest popular uprisings began, the German Peasants' War. Though partially inspired by Luther, he condemned the revolt and sided with the German authorities against it. By 1525, the revolt was brutally suppressed, with estimates of tens of thousands of peasants killed. It was the largest popular uprising in European history until the French Revolution. Luther's response to the Peasants' War tarnished his reputation among many of the lower classes, but it may have helped solidify his relationship with certain German princes who later became key supporters of the Lutheran Reformation. He most likely wanted to keep his religious views separate from the social and political spheres, in order to keep it palatable for the princes. The result was many of the German states breaking from Catholicism, taking control of their local churches. These became the first Lutheran churches and sprung up all over the Holy Roman Empire and north into Scandinavia. Luther also developed a new kind of church service, focused on singing hymns and reading scripture, to replace the rituals of the Catholic Mass. In the Lutheran Church, priests or ministers didn't have to practice celibacy, and Luther himself married a former nun in 1525. His later written works included attacks on Jews and targeted different Christian sects. His later years were also filled with a slew of health problems, and Martin Luther died in 1546, at the age of 62. Luther wasn't the first to challenge the Church's authority. An English theologian and Oxford professor, John Wycliffe, criticized various church doctrines, including the doctrine of transubstantiation. He emphasized the authority of the Bible over church traditions and advocated for its translation into vernacular languages. His followers, known as Lollards, continued his reformist ideas, translating the Bible into Middle English. The Catholic Church condemned Wycliffe as a heretic. After he died, his bones were exhumed and burned. Influenced by Wycliffe's ideas, Jan Hus became a leading figure of the Czech Reform movement. He spoke out against the moral failings of clergy and criticized various church practices, including the sale of indulgences. Hus was excommunicated and later invited to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe conduct. However, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. A crusade was then launched against those followers of Jan Hus in the Hussite Wars. The war was a foreshadowing of the wars of religion which would ravage Europe in the next 2 centuries. The Cathars, or Albigensians, were adherents of a Christian dualist movement from the 12th century in southern France. The Cathars held beliefs that starkly contrasted with Catholic teachings, including the inherent corruption of the material world and the rejection of the Old Testament. The Catholic Church launched a crusade against them in the early 13th century, leading to the movement's suppression. These figures and movements, among others, highlight the long history of criticism and calls for reform within the Church before Luther's time. During the 1500s, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, Charles V, ruled over one of the largest and most diverse territories in European history. His realm is often described with the phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," reflecting its vastness. In it was the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg territories, including Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia, the Habsburg Netherlands, and the Spanish Empire, including Spain, Naples, and the Spanish Americas. He hoped to preserve religious unity in his expansive domain. Because Charles was occupied with wars against the French and Ottomans, when he finally turned his attention to Germany, he found that too many princes had already established themselves as Lutheran, and they even formed an alliance together, called the Schmalkaldic League. The Schmalkaldic War broke out in 1546, and a short period of violence would continue for another year. The decisive battle came at Mulberg, in Saxony, where many Protestant princes were defeated and captured, and Catholicism was the seeming victor. But it was too late. Protestantism had taken root in Germany, and France even offered their support against Charles. A second Schmalkaldic War continued in 1552, and was a victory for the Protestant princes. In 1555, all Charles could do was acknowledge the division. With the Peace of Augsburg, each German ruler was allowed to decide whether their state was to be Lutheran or Catholic, and individuals who did not conform with the state religion had a grace period to leave. Around the same time as Luther, two other major reform movements were underway in Switzerland. The origins of the Swiss state date back to the 13th century. In 1291, three forest cantons, Uri, Schwyz, and Unterwalden, formed a defensive alliance, known as the Eternal Alliance. This is often considered the foundation of the Old Swiss Confederacy. The alliance was primarily against external threats, especially the Habsburgs, who were trying to consolidate their control over the Alpine passes. The newly appointed Austrian Vogt, or bailiff, named Albrecht Gessler, wanted to test the loyalty of the local populace. He placed his hat on a pole in the town square of Altdorf and ordered all the townspeople to bow before it, as a symbol of their submission to Habsburg rule. William Tell, a native of Uri and a skilled marksman, refused to bow to the hat. As punishment for his defiance, Gessler devised a cruel test. Tell was ordered to shoot an apple off the head of his own son, Walter, with a single bolt from his crossbow. If he failed, both would be executed. Tell successfully split the apple with his arrow, sparing his son from harm. But Gessler noticed that Tell had removed 2 arrows from his quiver before taking the shot and questioned him about the second arrow. Tell responded that if he had accidentally killed his son with the first arrow, the second would have been for Gessler. Infuriated by this bold statement, Gessler ordered Tell to be imprisoned for threatening his life. Tell was bound and put on a boat to be taken to Gessler's castle. The Swiss marksman escaped during a storm, and after lying in wait, shot and killed Gessler with his crossbow. Though his existence is still disputed, Tell eventually played a role in the rebellion that led to the formation of the Swiss Confederation, becoming a folk hero. Over the next 2 centuries, other regions and cities joined this confederation. Notably, during a series of conflicts, known as the Burgundian Wars in the late 15th century, the Swiss expanded its territory and gained a reputation for its formidable infantry, the Swiss pikemen. In 1499, after the Swabian War against the Holy Roman Empire, the Swiss effectively gained their independence, although still nominally part of the empire. Formal recognition did not come until later. Ulrich Zwingli, an ordained priest, began preaching in the Great Minster of Zurich in 1518. His sermons about reform became quite controversial quite quickly, and in 1523, the city council held a public debate. As many council members agreed with the priest, Zwingli and his team were victorious, and within a couple of years, church relics, images, and paintings were abolished. The Catholic Mass was replaced by reading of scripture, singing of hymns, and prayer. Papal authority was no longer recognized, nor the need for clerical celibacy or monastic lifestyles. As Zwingli's ideas spread throughout northern Switzerland, he and Martin Luther decided to form an alliance, in case of retaliation by Charles V. They met at the Marburg Colloquy in 1529, but it was soon evident that both Zwingli and Luther disagreed on fundamental aspects of Christianity, like baptisms and the use of images and music during worship. Their most significant disagreement was on the Eucharist, or Lord's Supper. Martin Luther held to the concept of the real presence in the Eucharist. Though Luther himself did not use the term, this view is often referred to as sacramental union or consubstantiation. He did reject the Roman Catholic doctrine which posits that the bread and wine are transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ, or transubstantiation. Zwingli believed the Eucharist was symbolic. For Zwingli, when believers take the bread and wine, they are not consuming the actual body and blood of Christ, but rather commemorating Christ's sacrifice. The bread and wine serve as reminders of Christ, rather than vehicles of his actual presence. War broke out in 1531, with the remaining Catholic states in the Confederacy. Zwingli was badly injured, and once found by his enemies, he was killed, sliced up, and his body parts burned. But from the ashes left behind by Zwingli, leadership of the Swiss Reformation passed to another. This was John Calvin, a French theologian. After converting to Protestantism, he fled from Catholic France to Geneva. In 1536, he published his seminal work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, one of the most influential works of Protestant theology. He agreed with most of Martin Luther's doctrine, most importantly the notion of justification by faith alone, but stressed the absolute sovereignty of God in salvation. This came to be known as predestination, a doctrine that states God is responsible for all events, including matters of the soul and salvation. This means God's will and purpose are supreme, and everything happens according to His divine plan. Some people had simply been predestined to be saved, called the elect, and some predestined to be damned, the reprobate. This of course begs the question of whether there is truly free will, which is a cornerstone of Christian teachings. Calvin emphasized there was no way to truly know whether someone was to be saved or not, but many of his followers felt convinced they were part of the elect. He was persuaded by another reformer, Guillaume Farel, to stay and help solidify the Reformation. However, their strict reforms and approach to church discipline led to tensions with the city council and populace, resulting in both Calvin and Farel being expelled from Geneva in 1538. When he returned in 1541, he was granted more authority by the city council to implement his reforms. Calvin set about restructuring the church and society in Geneva, based on his theological principles. He established the consistory, a body of church elders and pastors, to oversee moral discipline in the city. Those who did not conform to the new moral and religious standards could face penalties or even exile. Under Calvin's leadership, Geneva became known as the Protestant Rome. It was a hub for Protestant thought, education, from the Genevan Academy, and missionary work. Refugees from all over Europe, especially persecuted Protestants from France, flocked to Geneva. They absorbed Calvinist teachings and then spread them when they either returned to their homelands or migrated elsewhere. Over in England, Reformation would take a different path. Instead of criticisms rooted in theology, these were mostly political. In our last mega-documentary, we went over the War of the Roses and the rise of the Welsh House of Tudor, and first Tudor monarch Henry VII. His son, Arthur, was groomed to be the next king from a young age, and was betrothed to the daughter of Catholic Spanish monarchs Isabella and Ferdinand in an attempt to forge an Anglo-Spanish alliance. But soon after their marriage in 1501, Arthur died, possibly from sweating sickness. It was then upon Arthur's younger, more brash and charismatic brother, Henry VIII, to take up the responsibility of rulership. He not only sat in the throne that would have been Arthur's, he also married his ex-wife, Catherine of Aragon. Together, they had a daughter, named Mary, but after well over a decade of marriage, he still had no male heir and thought himself cursed for marrying his brother's wife. So Henry sought a divorce in order to marry Anne Boleyn, a woman around 20 years younger than Catherine. As the Pope wasn't willing to give him an annulment, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, ruled his marriage as annulled in 1533. A month later, Henry married Anne, and just a few months after that, she gave birth to a baby daughter, Elizabeth. But Henry still didn't have his male heir. During the rest of the 1530s, the king distanced himself from the Catholic Church, and the Reformation Parliament passed laws abolishing papal authority in England. Henry was increasingly attracted to the idea of asserting more direct control over the English Church's affairs. By declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England, he could make ecclesiastical decisions without the interference of Rome, centralizing and increasing his own power in the process. He began dissolving monasteries, convents, and suppressing those in religious orders. Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536 on charges of adultery, treason, and incest, and her marriage to Henry was annulled. He married noblewoman Jane Seymour just 11 days after the execution. Less than a year later, in early 1537, she gave Henry what he had been searching for. Edward was born, and Henry had his male heir. Jane died soon after from birth complications. Henry did marry again though. A political marriage was formed with Anne of Cleves, which remained unconsummated and was annulled after just 6 months. 17-year-old Catherine Howard didn't fare any better than her cousin Anne Boleyn, and was also executed. His last wife, Catherine Parr, was a supportive and caring woman who helped reconcile Henry with his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. As Henry grew older, he became so obese that he needed mechanical devices to move around. It's possible a jousting accident suffered in 1536 created a chronic wound that prevented him from physical activity. Catherine Parr, having already been twice widowed, experienced it once again in 1547, once King Henry died at the age of 55. He oversaw the legal incorporation of Wales, and was the first king to proclaim himself King of Ireland. His son, Edward, took the throne at just 9 years old, as Edward VI. As the boy was young, England was in the hands of other court officials. Though Henry broke ties with the Catholic Church, most ceremonies and practices were still from Catholic doctrine. But during Edward's reign, Thomas Cranmer and other religious leaders moved the Church of England towards Protestantism. Clergy was given the right to marry, and Catholic Mass was replaced with Protestant service. Edward died at just 15, and Mary, Henry's child with his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, took the throne. As a staunch Catholic, she attempted to reverse the English Reformation and restore links to the papacy. In 1557, she had 280 Protestants burned at the stake as heretics, giving her the name Bloody Mary. Young Edward had foreseen this during his last days, and attempted to remove Mary from succession, in favor of his Protestant cousin, the scholarly Lady Jane Grey, but after his death, Mary deposed Lady Jane, and beheaded her. When Mary died in 1558, the throne went to Henry's last surviving legitimate heir, Elizabeth I. The daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's legitimacy had been a point of contention. Despite the tumultuous circumstances surrounding her early life, including the execution of her mother and her own imprisonment during Mary's reign, Elizabeth's ascension was met with general approval. She inherited a kingdom riven by religious discord following the Protestant Reformation initiated by her father, and the subsequent Catholic Restoration under Mary. In 1559, aiming to address the religious divisions within her realm, Elizabeth introduced a series of acts collectively known as the Elizabethan Religious Settlement. Central to this was the Act of Supremacy, which re-established the monarch, not the Pope, as the head of the Church of England. This was accompanied by the Act of Uniformity, setting out the form of worship and solidifying the Protestant nature of the Church. While Elizabeth aimed for a moderate form of Protestantism to bridge divides, Catholics and Puritans continued to experience pressures and were often caught in political and religious intrigue. As Elizabeth's reign progressed, her relationship with Spain, the preeminent Catholic power of the era under Philip II, deteriorated. The reasons included the English piracy against Spanish galleons, English support for the Dutch Protestant rebels against Spanish rule, and the execution of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, a perceived threat to Elizabeth's reign. This made an invasion of England a more palatable idea for Catholic Europe. Tension culminated in 1588 when Philip II sent the Spanish Armada to invade England. The invasion was a significant failure due to mismanagement, English resilience, and unfavorable stormy weather, marking a turning point in the balance of power in Europe. Elizabeth's reign, often referred to as the Elizabethan era and a golden age, saw flourishing arts, exploration, and a strengthening of the English national identity. Iconic playhouses emerged, like the Globe, and playwrights, including Shakespeare, Marlowe, and Jonson, crafted masterpieces across tragedies, comedies, and histories. This theatre era engaged diverse audiences, providing a vibrant reflection of society's ethos and challenges. Despite facing numerous obstacles, both domestic and foreign, Elizabeth's leadership abilities and the counsel of her advisors ensured a stable and prosperous England. Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, died childless in 1603, and with her, the Tudor line of monarchs. While the Reformation was spreading in Switzerland, England, and Germany, an even more extreme form was coalescing. Anabaptists emerged in the 16th century, often called part of the Radical Reformation. One of the most defining beliefs of the Anabaptists was the rejection of infant baptism. They believed that baptism should be a conscious choice made by adults to affirm their faith. The term Anabaptist roughly means rebaptizer, which was a pejorative term used by their opponents, pointing to the fact that Anabaptists would get baptized as adults even if they had already been baptized as infants. They also abolished all hierarchies and treated all believers as equals. In differing from both Protestantism and Catholicism, they believed in a strict separation of church and state, meaning the government was to have no political power over them, while they themselves were not able to hold any public office. Anabaptists are known for their commitment to nonviolence and pacifism. They believed that the teachings of Jesus, particularly from the Sermon on the Mount, called for a life of non-resistance. Despite this, they became persecuted by both Protestants and Catholics. The Amish, Hutterites, and Mennonites are direct descendants of the early Anabaptist movement. By the mid-1500s, Protestantism had spread all across Europe, with Lutheranism in Germany and Scandinavia, Calvinism having spread from Switzerland to France, Scotland, the Netherlands, and Eastern Europe, and the Church of England, or Anglican Church. Prompted by the spread of Protestantism, the Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation. Some historians view this merely as the continuation of a reform movement that had begun during the Middle Ages. The most important religious order of the Catholic Reformation was the Society of Jesus, or Jesuits. Founded by Saint Ignatius of Loyola in 1534, the Jesuits became a central force in the Counter-Reformation and became recognized in 1540. Jesuits had absolute obedience to the Pope and were willing to engage in conflict for God. Their dedication to their cause led them to success in parts of Germany and Eastern Europe, where they reversed the Protestant spread. Jesuits were also instrumental in bringing Catholicism to those not even Christian. They were in luck, as Europe was in the midst of an age of discovery, which you can check out here. A co-founder, Francis Xavier, was responsible for converting tens of thousands in Portuguese India, Borneo, the Spice Islands, and Japan, but died just before reaching mainland China. Missions would continue to China though, under Matteo Ricci, leading to great success, as he emphasized the similarities between Confucianism and Catholicism. In direct response to the Protestant movement, the Roman Inquisition was established in 1542, aiming to defend the Catholic Church from Protestant heresies. It also dealt with issues of blasphemy, witchcraft, and certain scientific teachings, most famously the heliocentrism of Galileo, part of the scientific revolution that we will get to in a later episode. Cardinal Carafa, the later Pope Paul IV, was instrumental in its establishment. The infamous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or list of prohibited books, was maintained by this Inquisition to suppress writings that were deemed heretical or contrary to the faith. Well before Protestantism, the Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 and reached its peak in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Unlike the earlier medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition was under the direct control of the Spanish monarchy, though it operated with the blessing of the Pope. Its main targets were conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, and later, Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of practicing Islam in secret. It also targeted Protestantism and other perceived deviations from Catholicism. Tomás de Torquemada was the first Grand Inquisitor and one of the most notorious figures associated with the Spanish Inquisition. This Inquisition became infamous for its use of torture and public penance, called auto de fe, or acts of faith, where individuals were publicly sentenced, and sometimes executed. It was more centralized and bureaucratically organized than the medieval Inquisition. Pope Paul III recognized there was indeed corruption in the Church, especially by the long line of Renaissance popes, those elected since the Western Schism. The Pope summoned a council for deliberation, and in 1545, in northern Italy near the border of Germany, Church officials met at the Council of Trent. Its main objectives were to address and rectify the moral and administrative abuses criticized by Protestant reformers, and to clarify and reaffirm Catholic doctrine. Convened by Pope Paul III, the Council of Trent was the most important gathering of the Catholic Church during the Counter-Reformation. It clarified Catholic doctrine on the nature of salvation, the role of the sacraments, and the authority of the Pope and Church in relation to the Bible. Between 1545 and 1563, they met for 3 major sessions of 25 total meetings. The Catholic Reformation revitalized medieval Catholicism and added newer reforms, by focusing on devotional life and a personal relationship with Christ. New mystical movements emerged from this, like the Spanish mystics and French school of spirituality. They reaffirmed that both faith and good works are of equal importance, and the belief in purgatory and indulgences was strengthened, although the selling of them was prohibited. Originating in the early 17th century, Baroque art emerged from Rome and spread throughout Europe, characterized by its dramatic intensity, rich detail, and grandeur. It brought together the classical ideals of the Renaissance with the new Catholic religious revival. Emphasizing movement, contrast of light and shadow, and emotional depth, it was significantly influenced by the Counter-Reformation, seeking to captivate viewers. Artworks often depicted biblical stories and saints in a manner that was intended to inspire devotion and awe. Peter Paul Rubens was instrumental in the spread of the style out of Italy, and his work is well known for his full-bodied figures, both men and women. Caravaggio is particularly noted for his dramatic use of light and shadow. Baroque architecture, in particular, was characterized by its grandiosity. Cathedrals, palaces, and other buildings were constructed on a monumental scale, aiming to convey power and grandeur. John Lorenzo Bernini was perhaps the most prolific Baroque architect and sculptor. He designed the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica, with its iconic colonnades that embrace visitors from all over. Inside is the chair of St. Peter. It is traditionally thought to be a relic of Peter, the first Pope of Rome, and was gilded in bronze designed by Bernini. His sculpture, The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, is regarded as one of the centerpieces of high Baroque art. This particular work is a masterful representation of spiritual rapture, where light, architecture, and sculpture converge to create a dramatic visual and emotional experience. While the Counter-Reformation was successful in its goals of revitalizing the Catholic Church, stemming the tide of Protestantism in some regions, like Poland and parts of Germany, and gaining new adherents in colonial territories, the religious map of Europe had already undergone a significant transformation. By the end of the 16th century, Europe was divided into Protestant and Catholic regions, setting the stage for religious conflict. These conflicts were collectively called the European Wars of Religion. But prior to this, the Italian wars had continued on and off since the 1490s, with the Valois of France and Habsburgs of Spain and Austria, in an unending competition for European hegemony. King Francis of France was a patron of the arts, and had a fierce rivalry with Charles V during the Italian War of 1521 to 1526, which culminated in the disastrous Battle of Pavia in 1525, where Francis was captured. Francis was eventually released, but was deeply humiliated and sought to regain his lost territories and prestige. Pope Clement VII, alarmed by the increasing influence of Charles V in Italy and fearing a loss of papal authority and territory, was instrumental in forming the League of Cognac to counterbalance the emperor's power. This was a coalition of Italian states, backed by France and the papacy. During the War of the League of Cognac, however, Charles V's troops sacked Rome in 1527, marking a low point for the papacy and contributing to the decline of the Italian Renaissance. Two other Italian wars occurred in the 1530s and 1540s, where France even sought aid from the Ottomans. These Italian wars continued on, as part of the larger struggle between the French Valois and the Austrian Habsburg dynasties. King Francis's son, Henry II, married Catherine de' Medici, of the Medici family, and continued his father's fight with Charles V in the Italian War of 1551. This was sometimes known as the Last Italian War. After internal turmoil caused by the Reformation, France and the Habsburgs ended their conflict with the Treaty of Cateau Carbonari in 1559 to deal with problems at home, marking the end of the larger conflict. France had to make some territorial concessions and give up their claims in Milan. King Henry died just a few months later. His sons with Catherine, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, would each rule France, influenced by their mother. Their collective reigns became known as the Age of Catherine de' Medici. In France, the growing Calvinist movement was most notable among the nobility. French Calvinists were called Huguenots, a name derived from Swiss religious leader Besançon Hughes, and became a significant minority. The House of Bourbon, next in line from the Catholic House of Valois, became Huguenots. The French crown initially tried to suppress Protestantism, leading to mutual distrust and periodic violent outbursts. The power vacuum due to the young age of King Charles IX and the dynamics between the ruling families, particularly the House of Guise, Catholic, the House of Bourbon, Protestant, and the ruling Valois, officially Catholic but only valuing political stability, exacerbated these tensions. The First War began in 1562, with the massacre at Vassy, when the Duke of Guise men attacked Huguenots during a service. The war concluded with the Peace of Amboise, which granted limited rights to the Huguenots. One of the most notorious events during these wars occurred in 1572. Huguenot leaders came to Paris to celebrate the marriage of the Protestant Henry of Navarre to Margaret of Valois, a Catholic and sister to the king. The celebrations turned to horror when thousands of Huguenots, including key leaders, were killed in a wave of citywide violence that killed between 5,000 to 30,000. It's traditionally acknowledged that this was the work of Catherine de' Medici and her Catholic advisors. The event lives in infamy as the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. The next major conflict in 1587 saw King Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and Henry Duke of Guise against each other, in what came to be the War of the Three Henrys. It symbolized the deep divisions, the Guise championing the Catholic cause, and Navarre leading the Huguenots, while King Henry and his royalist allies tried to maintain control, prioritizing the state over either religion. There were several more skirmishes, which resulted in the assassination of Henry of Guise in 1588. A year later, a fanatical Catholic monk got revenge, assassinating King Henry, leaving only Henry of Navarre, the Huguenot. Henry of Navarre, from the House of Bourbon, became King Henry IV of France in 1589. A significant twist was his conversion to Catholicism, supposedly quipping, "Paris is well worth a mass." Despite his conversion, he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting religious freedoms to the Huguenots and ending the wars, although France was established as a Catholic state. He would be the first king from the House of Bourbon, a line that would remain until the French Revolution 2 centuries later. Over in Spain, the Habsburgs continued their rule. Once Charles V abdicated, he divided his immense empire between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs. His son, Philip II, inherited Spain, the Spanish colonies in the Americas, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and other territories. Philip centralized the Spanish government, working to curtail the power of the nobility and establish a strong, centralized monarchy. He was a deeply pious Catholic, and his reign saw the intensification of the Spanish Inquisition, aiming to root out heresy and Protestantism in his domains. Philip's reign was most brutal for the Protestants, as he became the champion for Catholicism, and viewed any new religion as depraved. Unfortunately for him, Calvinism had spread to the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. Philip's attempts to strengthen Catholicism and centralize control in this region led to a revolt headed by William I of Orange, a noble once loyal to the Habsburgs. This turned into a decades-long affair called the 80 Years' War. Though Philip's army had initial success during what came to be known as the Spanish Fury, the northern provinces, largely Protestant, eventually declared independence as the United Provinces of the Netherlands, or Dutch Republic in 1581. The southern provinces became the Catholic Netherlands, and are largely today's Belgium and Luxembourg. The Dutch Republic became quite active in the Age of Discovery, growing quite rich from their commerce in the East, leading to a golden age, when their trade, science, art, and colonization were among the foremost in Europe. Many wealthy urbanites and burghers commissioned art for their homes or to be displayed in public, mostly a style called Dutch realism. This stood apart from the Baroque, with its secular focus on daily life, landscapes, seascapes, still lifes, and portraiture. This art, marked by meticulous attention to detail and an emphasis on capturing mood and atmosphere, reflected the values and prosperity of the Dutch Republic. Renowned artists like Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Hals depicted scenes with a profound sense of authenticity and introspection. Despite the setback, Spain was still seen as the most powerful entity on the continent, especially after forming a dynastic union with Portugal in 1580, and their conquests in the Americas and the Southeast Asian islands, which came to be named after King Philip, the Philippines. Philip also cemented himself as the most Catholic king after victory at the Battle of Lepanto, which halted the Ottoman navy and marked a turning point in the Ottoman expansion into the Mediterranean. The Spanish Golden Age that had started under Isabella and Ferdinand rolled on under the reigns of Philip III and Philip IV, until the mid-1600s. Back in England, what was to become of the throne after the passing of Queen Elizabeth and the Tudors? Her cousin, and King of Scotland, James VI, assumed the throne of England as James I of the House of Stuart, uniting the crowns of both kingdoms. He was a proponent of the divine right of kings, leading to tensions with Parliament, which was composed of many Puritans, those nominally of the Anglican Church who wished to move further from Catholicism and towards Calvinism. King James also faced pushback from Catholics, and faced assassination in 1605 during the Gunpowder Plot. Led by a group of English Catholics, including Robert Catesby and Guy Fawkes, they sought to blow up the House of Lords, and restore a Catholic monarch to the throne, but their plan failed. Friction continued with the next king, Charles I, who also believed in absolute monarchy, leading to quarrels with Parliament over finances and the extent of his royal authority. The period between 1629 to 1640, known as the Personal Rule or 11 Years' Tyranny, saw Charles rule without summoning Parliament. His marriage to a Catholic and his attempts to add more ritual to the Anglican Church angered the Puritans, and many of them fled England for a new life in the new colonies in what would become America. In 1620, the Pilgrims, seeking a complete break with the Anglican Church, sailed on the Mayflower and established the Plymouth colony in present-day Massachusetts. The Puritans weren't separatist, but sought to purify the Church with a shift towards Calvinism. Most remained in England, but some sailed over to America later, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, with John Winthrop serving as their first governor. Many Puritans migrated to this colony in the 1630s during this Great Migration. Between 1639 and 1653, a series of interconnected conflicts took place in England, Scotland, and Ireland. These were the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. These wars were rooted in religious, political, and constitutional disputes. The first of the conflicts began with the Bishops' Wars. These were between Scotland and King Charles I of England. The immediate cause was Charles' attempt to impose Anglican practices on the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, a Protestant branch based on a system of elders and is more democratic in nature. Local congregations elect their ministers and elders, and there is no single church head, emphasizing the collective decision-making process. The Scottish banded together as a covenant and fought the English as the Covenanters, bringing firm resistance to Charles' religious reforms. Two short wars ensued, both of which ended in embarrassment for Charles and strengthened opposition to his rule in both Scotland and England. Back in England, rising tensions between the king and Parliament led to the more consequential English Civil War, between the Royalists and Parliamentarians, called Cavaliers and Roundheads by their opposition. The Royalists, as their name suggests, were supporters of King Charles I, while the Parliamentarians were initially fighting for constitutional rights and parliamentary sovereignty. The Civil War is often divided into three separate wars. The First Civil War ended with the capture of Charles I. The second erupted when Charles I attempted to regain power with Scottish support. The Parliamentarian army was eventually victorious because of Thomas Fairfax and Oliver Cromwell's new model army, composed of the most extreme Puritans who believed they were fighting as the hand of God. This became England's first standing army, a truly national English army. It was funded by the state and grew to represent the entire country rather than a specific region or lord. The war ended with the defeat, trial, and execution of Charles I in 1649, making him the only English monarch to be executed. The Third Civil War began when Charles II, the son of Charles I, attempted to regain the throne with Scottish support, but it ended with the Parliamentarian victory at the Battle of Worcester. The monarchy and House of Lords were abolished, and the English Commonwealth was declared. Later, Oliver Cromwell, a key figure in the parliamentarian faction, became Lord Protector, implementing a military dictatorship. Troubles were brewing in the Third Kingdom though, Catholic Ireland, troubles which started earlier in the decade. These turbulent times were called the Irish Confederate Wars. This conflict began with the Irish Rebellion of 1641, where Irish Catholics rose against English Protestant settlers and the English administration in Ireland. It evolved into the War of the Irish Confederates, a Catholic coalition against English and Scottish forces. The Confederates sought to gain greater autonomy and religious freedom. But in 1649, Oliver Cromwell launched a brutal invasion of Ireland, which saw the defeat of both the Irish Confederates and the Royalists. The war culminated in the English conquest of Ireland and the Cromwellian settlement, which involved land confiscations and the penalizing of Catholics. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms were deeply interconnected, with shifting religious and political alliances. Cromwell's rule saw strict puritanical laws, the suppression of the Irish and Scottish uprisings, and expansion of overseas colonies. The dictatorship was simply not sustainable, however, and once Cromwell died in 1658, his son, Richard, was forcibly removed, and the monarchy was restored. Charles I's son, Charles II, then assumed the throne in 1660. His reign witnessed significant events like the Great Plague of 1665, the Great Fire of London in 1666, and he faced challenges from Parliament over his pro-Catholic positions. But he did rescind the puritanical laws, and many forms of entertainment returned, like theatre. His younger brother, James II, took the throne in 1685. As an open and devout Catholic, tensions with Parliament were almost immediate, as he named Catholics to high positions in government, the army, and universities. Outright rebellion was tempered for the time being, as James was middle-aged, and his successors, daughters Mary and Anne, were both Protestant. But in 1688, a son was born to James and his second wife, who was also Catholic, which ensured Catholic succession. In response, several English nobles invited Mary's husband, William of Orange, a Protestant Dutch prince, and great-grandson to William the Silent, to intervene. They amassed an army and invaded England, as King James and his family fled to France. Barring revolt outside of England, there was little fighting, and William and Mary were crowned co-rulers by Parliament, in what is known as the Glorious Revolution. The Bill of Rights in 1689 solidified Parliament's role in governance. Citizens were also given the right to arms and to a fair trial. Their reign ensured a Protestant succession and curtailed its powers, solidifying the constitutional monarchy. It was Parliament which gave the king its power, not God. Mary died in 1694, but William continued to reign until his death in 1702. Anne, the last of the Stuart monarchs, oversaw the Acts of Union in 1707, which formally united the kingdoms of England and Scotland, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain, and marking the beginning of a new chapter in the island's history. The 1600s was a volatile time for most of Europe, as states dealt with economic, social, and political changes. Economic changes occurred first. The influx of gold and silver from the New World caused significant inflation, in what's known as the Price Revolution. But as the century progressed, the growth of trade routes, both within Europe and its connections to the wider world of Africa, the Americas, and Asia, fueled a burgeoning market economy. Mercantilism emerged as the dominant economic theory of the early modern European states. This economic policy was based on the belief that national power was directly tied to wealth. As a result, nations sought to accumulate precious metals, especially gold and silver, by ensuring a favorable balance of trade, exporting more goods than they imported. To achieve these economic goals, states intervened heavily in their economies. This era saw the growth of powerful trading empires, particularly by the Dutch, English, and French. While most European states still primarily relied on trade within Europe, the products imported for the nobility, like spices, teas, and sugars, began to reach the middle classes. The early 17th century saw the rise of joint stock companies. These were precursors to modern corporations, where individuals could buy shares in a venture. This spread the risk among many investors and allowed the pooling of large amounts of capital. The most famous of these were the English East India Company, founded in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. These companies were given monopolistic trading rights in vast regions and became powerful entities in their own right. The rise of joint stock companies was a significant step towards modern capitalism. They promoted the expansion of global trade networks and colonization. The growth of these companies, and the wealth they generated, contributed significantly to the shift from a feudal agrarian economy to a more urban and commercial one. There was social change as well. As religious fervor was high both for Catholics and Protestants, people were susceptible to certain hysterias or perceived threats, like that of witchcraft. The late 1500s and early 1600s is often regarded as the peak of European witch hunting. While beliefs in witchcraft and magic had ancient roots, the mix of religious fervor from the Reformation and social crises all around made people more susceptible to this hysteria. Witch trials and executions became common, especially in the Holy Roman Empire, France, England, Scotland, and Scandinavia. So too were theological debates about the nature of witches and their compacts with the devil. European intellectuals and clergymen, both Catholic and Protestant, wrote treatises on the subject. Witches were believed to reject God, make pacts with the devil, attend Sabbaths, and engage in harmful magic, like causing disease or crop failures. The trials of this period often followed a pattern. An accusation, usually by the locals, would lead to an arrest, followed by interrogation, often involving torture. This would frequently result in confessions, which would then implicate others. The Malleus Maleficarum, a handbook for witch hunters, played a role in guiding some of these trials. It is thought over 100,000 were accused, with 75% being women, many of them single or poor widows and over the age of 50. It was thought women were more susceptible to the temptations of Satan, and that instead of finding a husband, they would participate in the carnal pleasures of demonic parties. By the mid-17th century, skepticism about witch hunting began to grow. More enlightened jurists and intellectuals started questioning the validity of confessions obtained under torture, and even the very existence of witches. By the end of the century, witch trials and executions were waning in most parts of Europe, although they didn't entirely disappear until the 18th century. Political shifts began in 1618, with the culmination to the European Wars of Religion, the 30 Years' War. Though the catalyst was religious in nature, the war itself was more political than anything. It mainly took place in Central Europe. Here, Charles V's younger brother, Ferdinand I, inherited the other part of his empire, the Habsburg hereditary lands in Central Europe, and became the Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand I's reign, like that of his nephew, Philip II in Habsburg Spain, was marked by his commitment to Catholicism amidst the growing threat of Protestantism. Ferdinand's reign thus witnessed a deepening religious divide in the empire. Maximilian II was quite different from his father. Although raised as a Catholic, he showed considerable religious tolerance. He allowed Lutheran worship within his realms and attempted to find a middle ground between the two faiths, even though he couldn't achieve religious unity. His reign stands out as a brief period of relative religious peace. Rudolf II is best known for his patronage of the arts and sciences, making Prague the epicenter of the Renaissance in Central Europe. He was an eccentric and introverted monarch, with a keen interest in alchemy, astrology, and the occult. His court in Prague became a haven for artists, scientists, and scholars. Matthias, Rudolf's brother, took over the throne after Rudolf's inability to address the religious and political challenges effectively. However, his reign is marked by a great shadow that would engulf Central Europe in darkness and flame for decades. In the Holy Roman Empire, a sprawling realm of diverse peoples and territories, religious unrest continued to simmer. Over the past century, the rise of Protestant states had fractured the Christian world. The immediate spark of war was the Bohemian Revolt. In 1617, the Catholic Ferdinand II was crowned King of Bohemia, a kingdom with a significant Protestant population. Ferdinand's policies seemed to infringe upon the religious rights of Protestants, particularly with the closing of Protestant churches. It was against this backdrop of religious fervor that an audacious act occurred in Prague. In 1618, 2 Catholic officials were thrown out of a castle window by Protestant nobles, an event dramatically termed the defenestration of Prague. Miraculously, both men survived, supposedly saved by a heap of dung, but the act had far-reaching implications. It was a stark declaration of defiance against the Catholic Habsburg rule. The climax of this Bohemian phase was the Catholic victory at the Battle of White Mountain in 1620, which largely subdued Bohemian resistance. But as the rebellion in Bohemia grew, other European powers began to take notice. The early years of the war were marked by Catholic success, but the Protestant call for aid did not go unanswered. King Christian IV of Denmark, a Lutheran, entered the fray to support the Protestant cause, beginning the Danish phase. But he was driven out after a series of defeats, mainly due to the efforts of Catholic forces under Albrecht von Wallenstein and Johann Cerclas, Count of Tilly. Ferdinand II, now Holy Roman Emperor, issued the Edict of Restitution in 1629, which aimed to return to the Church all properties that had been secularized since 1552. The Danish advance was followed by the entrance of Sweden in 1630. Under the leadership of the formidable Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden's innovative tactics revitalized the Protestant cause. Adolphus was among the first to abandon the deep tercio square formations in favor of a more linear one, which improved firepower and maneuverability. This allowed his musketeers to deliver more effective volleys and his pikemen to be more flexible in combat. He integrated musketeers and pikemen into combined units, known as brigades. This allowed the musketeers to fire and then retreat behind the safety of the pikemen when charged by cavalry. Adolphus died at the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, but Swedish forces continued the fight. Adolphus cemented the Swedish Empire as the most prominent Nordic state for another century, and it became one of Europe's great military powers. This phase eventually concluded with the Peace of Prague in 1635, which saw many German states reconcile with the emperor. In France, Henry IV continued to rule as the first Bourbon king, but was viewed as a traitor to the Huguenots, and a usurper to the Catholics. After surviving at least 12 assassination attempts, he was killed by François Ravaillac, a Catholic zealot. Louis XIII became king as a child after the assassination of his father. His reign is best known for the influence of his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, who strengthened the power of the monarchy and reduced the influence of the nobility. Despite the cardinal suppressing Huguenot uprisings, he led France into the 30 Years' War in 1635, siding with the Protestant states, not out of religious sentiment but rather to curtail Habsburg power. This phase shifted the war from being primarily about religious conflict to being more focused on political and dynastic rivalries in Europe. The war dragged on with various fortunes until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which concluded the war. Like the Peace of Augsburg, it allowed rulers to choose their realm's religion, but also included Calvinism. The empire's political landscape was forever altered, but so too was the notion of international relations. The war, with all its horror and complexity, ushered in a new age, one where states, not religion, would determine a nation's unity. At the end of the 30 Years' War, it's estimated between 5 to 8 million people perished as a result, with Germany losing 30 to 40% of its population. During the conflict, dissatisfaction grew among the Portuguese nobility, leading to secret conspiracies against Spanish rule. On December 1, 1640, a group of Portuguese noblemen, supported by the general populace, staged a coup in Lisbon and declared the independence of Portugal. The conspirators offered the crown to the Duke of Braganza, who became King João IV of Portugal. The Braganza dynasty would rule Portugal until the establishment of the First Portuguese Republic in 1910. Spain did not easily accept Portugal's declaration of independence. This led to the Portuguese Restoration War, which lasted from 1640 to 1668. Despite Spanish attempts to retake Portugal, the Portuguese, with assistance from England and France, managed to defend their territory. The war came to an end with the Treaty of Lisbon in 1668, in which Spain formally recognized Portugal's independence. By the mid-1600s, the growth of standing armies increased, along with an increased military bureaucracy. Navies also grew larger, and the galleon evolved once more to the ship of the line. These ships were designed almost exclusively for naval warfare. They were larger and carried a more extensive array of artillery when compared to galleons. Ships of the line were classified based on their number of guns, with a first-rate ship carrying the most artillery and being the most powerful. These military innovations and improvements led to higher taxes and more consolidation of state power, which was the theme during the late 1600s, a time when this power was consolidated in the monarch, a time called the Age of Absolutism. The Age of Absolutism was a period when several European monarchs expanded their power. They reduced the influence of nobility and other traditional checks on royal authority, a political system called divine right monarchy. In France, after Louis XIII died of natural causes, Louis XIV ascended to the throne as a child, but would become the emblem of absolutist rule in Europe. His early reign was dominated by the regency of his mother, Anne of Austria, and the guidance of Cardinal Mazarin. Early on, a series of civil wars and political upheaval took place in France between 1648 and 1653, called the Fronde. It represented a critical resistance against the centralized power of the French monarchy. The term Fronde is French for sling, which was a tool used by Parisian mobs during the revolt to hurl stones at the homes of perceived enemies. The first phase was known as the Fronde of the Parlement. It was led by members of the Parlement of Paris, which was the chief judicial body in France. The Parlement sought to curb the growing power of the monarchy and prevent the increasing centralization of authority. This Fronde resulted in a short-lived peace treaty, but tensions remained. The final phase was the Fronde of the Nobles. It was led primarily by high-ranking nobles and princes, who were discontented with the central authorities' infringement on their traditional rights and privileges. They felt marginalized from the centralized power structure being developed by Mazarin. This Fronde had more of a military character than the first, with several battles and skirmishes taking place. It ended by 1653 with the victory of the royal forces and the solidification of the monarchy's authority. The Fronde was significant for young Louis. It shaped his perspective on governance and influenced his determination to centralize power, and the avoidance of sharing authority with other nobles. Once he took personal control, he embarked on a policy of strengthening the monarchy at the expense of the nobility and the regional parliaments. To disempower the nobility and those of the royal council, he had them all move into the stunning palace of Versailles, his father's chateau, which he greatly expanded. There, Louis was able to keep an eye on the nobles and princes of the blood, keeping them out of public or political life. Believing in the divine right of kings, he adopted the sun as his emblem, viewing himself as the central, indispensable element in the political system. He concentrated executive, legislative, and judicial powers in his person, proclaiming, "L'État c'est moi," meaning I am the state. With so many nobles living at Versailles along with Louis, he had very little privacy, and most days were filled with court activities and rituals. Nobles were expected to follow a specific etiquette, and often tried to help the king during even mundane daily routines, like handing him his shirt as he was getting dressed. During the latter part of the king's reign, he engaged in several wars, expanding French territory and influence but also draining the royal coffers. In the Dutch War, also known as the Franco-Dutch War, Louis sought to punish the Dutch Republic, particularly for its economic rivalry and its role in a previous anti-French coalition. France made rapid advances into Dutch territory, but a larger European coalition formed against Louis, slowing his ambitions. The conflict ended in 1678, and France was awarded several territories, further extending its borders. The 9 Years' War, also known as the War of the Grand Alliance, began due to Louis XIV's territorial and dynastic claims in various parts of Europe. A large European coalition, called the Grand Alliance, formed against France, but it served as just a prelude for the most significant and last major war of Louis's reign, the War of the Spanish Succession. Spain's golden age ended with the reign of Philip IV. His only surviving son, Charles II, was born to Philip's own niece, Mariana of Austria. It was common for the Spanish Habsburgs to marry Austrian Habsburgs in order to keep their line intact. Because this had been practiced for generations, Charles was born with an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, around the same as an offspring from siblings. He was born with physical disabilities, and was most likely sterile, unable to produce an heir. His chin, what became known as the Habsburg jaw, was so prominent that a British letter describes him like so.
He has a ravenous stomach, and swallows all he eats whole, for his nether jaw stands so much out, that his 2 rows of teeth cannot meet.
Once he died in 1700, the line of Spanish Habsburgs went extinct, and there was a succession crisis. Given the vast extent of the Spanish Empire, which included not just Spain but parts of Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, and a colossal colonial empire in the Americas and Philippines, the question of his succession was of utmost importance to the European balance of power. When Charles II died in 1700, he left a will that designated French King Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, as his successor, under the condition that the French and Spanish crowns remained separate. Louis initially respected this condition, but European powers, especially Austria, the Dutch Republic, and England, were deeply suspicious. Their fears seemed to be confirmed when in 1701 Louis allowed Philip to become King of Spain, as Philip V, and seemed to renege on earlier agreements to partition the Spanish territories. This series of events led to the formation of another Grand Alliance, including the Austrian Habsburg claimant to the Spanish throne, the Dutch Republic, England, and several other states, to counter the potential Franco-Spanish Bourbon superstate. This alliance declared war on France in 1702. The war was fought on several fronts, in Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and in the colonies. Key battles included Blenheim in 1704, Ramillies in 1706, and Malplaquet in 1709. The war dragged on until 1714 when the Treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt were signed. These treaties recognized Philip V as the Bourbon King of Spain, but confirmed the French and Spanish crowns would remain separate to prevent an overwhelming concentration of power. Though a Bourbon now sat on the Spanish throne, he renounced his claims to the French succession, and most of the Spanish Habsburg possessions on the continent, like the Spanish Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, Milan, and Sardinia, passed to the Austrian Habsburg branch. The war reshaped the European geopolitical landscape, confirming the decline of Spain as a dominant European power and limiting the territorial and dynastic ambitions of Bourbon France. The Treaty of Utrecht is often seen as an early example of a balance of power diplomacy, where the major European states sought to prevent any single power from becoming too dominant. Louis XIV died the next year, in 1715, from gangrene, just 4 days before his 77th birthday. His over 72 years on the throne makes him still the longest reigning monarch of all time, almost a full 2 years more than Queen Elizabeth II. Further east, Poland and Lithuania were officially united into a single state under the Union of Lublin in 1569, establishing the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The union was a response to external threats and the need for a stronger alliance. The 16th and early 17th centuries were a golden age of cultural, political, and economic flourishing for the Commonwealth. This was also the period when the vast state was the largest country in Europe, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. A series of wars and invasions, particularly by Sweden, devastated the Commonwealth. Though Poland-Lithuania survived, it was severely weakened. 3 new powers would become quite important from the 1700s onwards, annexing most of Poland-Lithuania. These were Prussia, Austria, and Russia. The region that would become Prussia originally consisted of 2 parts, the Duchy of Prussia and Brandenburg. The Duchy of Prussia had been part of the state formed by the Teutonic Order and remained a fiefdom of Poland, while Brandenburg was a principality in the Holy Roman Empire. These lands came to be ruled by the Hohenzollern dynasty. During the 30 Years' War, Brandenburg-Prussia, under George William, suffered extensively from marauders and foreign troops. It's a period marked by depopulation, economic decline, and devastation. Frederick William, the Great Elector, played a pivotal role in elevating the status of Prussia. His reign saw the consolidation of Hohenzollern territories, administrative reforms, and the enhancement of the military. After the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in France, which had granted religious rights to the Protestant Huguenots, Frederick William issued the Edict of Potsdam, inviting the French Huguenots to Prussia, boosting the economy and encouraging urban growth. Recognizing the significance of a strong military, Frederick William developed a standing army financed through direct taxes, and came to have the fourth largest in Europe. This move laid the foundation for Prussia's later reputation as a major military power. Elector Frederick III crowned himself king in Prussia in 1701, becoming King Frederick I, marking the transition from a duchy to a kingdom. The title reflects a compromise, acknowledging the continued higher status of the Holy Roman Emperor, while elevating Prussia's prestige. In Austria, the end of the 30 Years' War marked a shift in Habsburg interest. The Habsburgs, especially under Leopold I, faced significant threats from the Ottoman Empire. The Battle of St. Gotthard in 1664 and the Siege of Vienna in 1683 are major confrontations. The Siege of Vienna, in particular, proved pivotal as a combined Christian force, including Polish and German troops, repelled the Ottoman siege. We will be covering the Ottoman expansion, and much more, next episode. Following the victory over the Ottomans, Austria was granted large parts of Hungary, Transylvania, Croatia, and Slovenia, with the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, solidifying the empire's control in southeastern Europe. As mentioned earlier, the Austrian Habsburgs acquired numerous territories from the Spanish after the War of Spanish Succession. Further to the east, Moscow and the Russian state continued to grow. After Ivan the Great repelled the Golden Horde in 1480, Vasily III continued his father's policies of expansion and consolidation. Ivan the Terrible, or more accurately, the Terrifying or Powerful, then became Grand Prince in 1533, and in 1547, took the title of Tsar of all Russia, a word derived from Caesar, as Moscow had considered itself the Third Rome. Ivan expanded Russian borders eastwards, and established a personal and terrorizing regime, the Oprichnina, which targeted the boyar class, the highest-ranking nobility. The Oprichniki, a personal force loyal to him, inflicted terror upon the population, leading to massacres. Attempting to secure access to the Baltic Sea, Ivan instigated the Livonian War in 1558, a prolonged conflict against several entities including Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden, who were formidable foes at the time. It ended disastrously for Russia, which gained no access to the sea and suffered economic difficulties. Ivan's son, Ivan Ivanovich, was the heir apparent, but allegedly met his demise at the hands of his own father. Following the death of Ivan IV and his son, the Rurikid dynasty, founded by Rurik the Varangian and remained a ruling house for over 700 years, was over. Russia then plunged into a period of political instability known as the Time of Troubles, involving false Dimitris, pretenders to the throne, and famine. This ended in 1613, when Michael Romanov was elected as Tsar by the National Assembly, or Zemsky Sobor, marking the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would rule Russia until 1917. By the end of the century, the 6'9" Peter I, or Peter the Great, became Tsar. Initially ruling with his half-brother Ivan V, he became the sole ruler after Ivan's death in 1696. Peter enforced numerous reforms to modernize Russia, pulling inspiration from Western Europe. These reforms included modernizing the military and introducing a new legal code. He built a standing army of over 200,000 conscripted peasants and laid the groundwork for the state's first navy, the Imperial Russian Navy, which would become Europe's third most powerful. Seeking access to the Baltic Sea as a window to the west, Peter had to contend with Sweden, resulting in the Great Northern War. After a decades-long war, Russia was victorious, and with the Treaty of Nystad, the Swedish Empire went into decline. Peter's founding of the city of St. Petersburg in 1703 on the swampy lands near the Baltic Sea acted as Russia's window to the west. The city, built with forced labor, quickly became Russia's new capital and a symbol of the nation's modernization. Following the significant victory of the Great Northern War, Peter adopted the title of Emperor of all Russia, thereby transforming the Tsardom into an empire. This was not just a change in title, but also a declaration of Russia's new status as a major European power. During the early modern, Russia also began expanding to the east, conquering territory from the indigenous Turkic and Mongolic peoples of Siberia and the Far East. By the 1700s, Russian territory spanned all across northern Asia. Prussia, Austria, and Russia became some of the most significant European states heading into the 1700s and beyond.